So she was a very broken woman when she met Prince Charles, and that was, as we all know, a terribly unhappy marriage. But she then became glamorous. She suddenly discovered her fame because she was very beautiful and very charming.
For years, Prince Harry had lived outside the royal gates, insisting he no longer needed the institution that shaped him. But when a private message arrived suggesting King Charles was finally ready to meet, Harry reportedly saw something far greater than reconciliation, a possible road back into royal life. The message was brief, carefully worded, and far from a guarantee. Yet to Harry, it carried the weight of everything that had been left unresolved. Years of public accusations, explosive interviews, legal battles, private grievances, and painful separation had turned a simple father and son conversation into something almost historic. This was not merely an invitation to speak. It felt like a chance to change the direction of his life. His first reaction was deeply personal. Beneath the titles, the anger, and the public defiance, Harry was still a son, longing to know that his father had not completely turned away from him. But another feeling quickly rose beside that hope. A meeting with the king could restore more than affection. It could reopen discussions about security, family access, royal ceremonies, and perhaps even a limited place within the institution he had once abandoned. That possibility revealed a truth Harry rarely admitted openly. He had built a new life in California and created an identity outside the crown, but he had never fully stopped looking back. The monarchy remained part of his name, his history, and his sense of importance. No amount of distance could entirely erase the world that had defined him from birth. Meghan, however, was more cautious. She understood that the palace did not make sensitive approaches without purpose. To her, the message could be sincere, but it could also be a test designed to measure Harry's silence, loyalty, and willingness to accept conditions. She warned him not to mistake contact for acceptance. Harry was already imagining what might follow. A private reunion could lead to appearances at family events. It could improve access to his father. It might strengthen his position in security discussions and slowly restore the royal relevance he had lost. None of this had been promised. Yet, hope began filling the gaps, and hope had always been Harry's most dangerous weakness. Every small sign from Charles carried the emotional force of years of rejection. A few carefully chosen words could become a promise in his mind long before the palace intended them to mean anything at all. Inside royal circles, unease was already spreading. Senior courtiers feared that any private exchange could later emerge through friends, interviews, or another personal account. They wanted strict limits, clear boundaries, and complete control. Then, another royal learned of the proposed meeting. His response was immediate, and it threatened to change everything. Harry believed the palace door was finally opening, but behind that door, the most powerful figures in the monarchy were already debating whether he should ever be allowed through it again. Harry may have expected resistance from courtiers, advisors, and palace officials. What he was not prepared for was the possibility that Prince William himself would oppose the meeting. To William, this was not simply about an estranged brother, it was about protecting the monarchy from another devastating breach of trust. When William learned that Charles was considering a private conversation with Harry, his concern was immediate. He did not see a harmless family meeting. He saw a risk the palace had taken before, only to watch private pain become public evidence in interviews, accusations, and deeply personal accounts of royal life. For William, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Each attempt to reduce the tension seemed to create another opening through which family conversations could escape. Words spoken in confidence no longer felt protected. Recollections could be repeated, reshaped, and presented to the world long after the moment had passed. In William's mind, trust was not simply damaged. It had become dangerous. His opposition was therefore about more than resentment. As the future king, William believed he had a duty to look beyond Charles's immediate emotions. One private decision made out of guilt or affection could create consequences for the entire institution. The monarchy could not afford another crisis built around conversations no one could later deny or explain. Charles was caught between two identities that could not easily exist together. As a father, he feared that continued distance might push Harry away permanently. As king, he knew that personal compassion could not come at the cost of royal stability. Every path carried pain. Behind closed doors, advisors began discussing how the meeting could be controlled. Some suggested a strict time limit. Others wanted no aids from Harry's side, no written notes, and no discussion of sensitive family or constitutional matters. The conversation was no longer being treated as reconciliation. It was being treated as containment. William's deepest concern, however, went further. Rumors suggested Harry might want more than contact with his father. The meeting could become the first step toward renewed appearances, stronger security claims, or a limited return to royal duties. To William, that possibility threatened to blur a line the palace had spent years making clear. Harry remained a prince by birth, but William's position now carried greater authority inside the monarchy. The future of the crown stood behind his warnings, while Harry's demands were increasingly viewed through the memory of past conflict. Even palace officials were divided. One group believed a meeting might lower the temperature and prevent another public rupture. The other feared it would reward years of attacks and encourage Harry to push for more. Then a condition emerged that could settle the argument, but only by forcing Harry to prove where his loyalty truly stood. As William tightened the boundaries around his father, palace advisors prepared a set of conditions that would turn Harry's hope for homecoming into something far more dangerous, a test of obedience. The meeting was never going to be unconditional. Behind palace walls, a list of demands was reportedly taking shape: silence, discretion, distance from controversy, and proof that Harry could place the monarchy above personal grievance. For the first time, his royal future appeared to depend on rules he could not rewrite. Palace advisors did not view the proposed conversation as an open door. They saw it as an evaluation. Before Harry could be trusted with influence, access, or even the suggestion of a future role, he would have to prove that the cycle of private contact, followed by public exposure, had finally ended. The first condition was absolute. Nothing discussed with Charles could appear in an interview, memoir, documentary, speech, or conversation with unnamed sources. The palace wanted silence that could be measured over time, not promises offered in an emotional moment. To Harry, this demand carried an accusation. To the monarchy, it was the minimum price of trust. The second condition was even more sensitive. The initial meeting would be between father and son alone. Meghan would not attend, participate through advisors, or influence the exchange through intermediaries. Harry immediately recognized the danger. He could interpret the restriction as another effort to isolate him from his wife, while palace officials insisted they were trying to rebuild one broken relationship before confronting the entire family conflict. Then came security. Harry wanted firm guarantees that he and his family would be protected during visits to Britain. But Charles could not simply command legal and government bodies to grant everything his son requested. The issue that Harry considered essential remained beyond the king's complete control. There was also the question no one wanted to state openly. Harry appeared interested in more than private reconciliation. A limited public role, selected appearances, support for chosen causes, and occasional participation in royal events might allow him to regain relevance without returning fully to palace discipline. The monarchy considered that arrangement impossible. Royal service demanded accountability, restriction, loyalty, and constant scrutiny. Harry and Meghan's independent commercial life could not easily exist beside official representation of the crown. Meghan warned him that accepting these terms could mean surrendering control of their story. The palace would decide when they appeared, what they could discuss, and how their family's future would be defined. Yet, Harry also feared that refusing would confirm every suspicion held against him. Instead of accepting immediately, he asked for clarification. He believed he was protecting Meghan, his children, and his dignity. The palace saw negotiation where it had expected obedience. Then came the final condition. Before any wider royal return could be considered, Harry would have to repair his relationship with William privately, and he could not begin by demanding an apology. Charles waited. William watched. The advisers grew impatient. Harry thought he was negotiating the terms of a meeting, but the palace believed it was measuring whether he had changed, and his hesitation would soon trigger a decision that destroyed everything. Then came the message Harry had feared. The meeting was no longer happening. No warm explanation, no new date, and no clear promise that the invitation would return. King Charles had cancelled, leaving his younger son facing a brutal possibility. The reconciliation he imagined may never have truly existed. The official explanation was restrained, polished, and almost impossible to challenge. The king's schedule had become too demanding. Royal duties required attention. Medical considerations had to come first. There was not enough time, Harry was reportedly told, for the kind of serious and meaningful conversation both sides supposedly wanted. But Harry did not hear a scheduling problem. He heard rejection. After years of distance, the palace had briefly allowed him to believe that something might change. Then, before he could enter the room, speak directly to his father, or explain what he wanted, the opportunity disappeared. Even more painful was what the message did not contain. There was no replacement date, no promise to rearrange the meeting, no clear sign that Charles intended to revive the conversation later. A postponement without a future began to feel like a cancellation with purpose. Harry's suspicion quickly turned toward William. He could not prove that his brother had demanded the meeting be stopped, but he believed William's warnings had shaped the atmosphere around the king. Every concern about trust, confidentiality, Meghan, security, and royal responsibility now seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. Harry was still considered too dangerous to admit without complete control. Charles, however, remained trapped in a painful contradiction. He may have wanted to see his younger son, but advisers warned that meeting before Harry accepted the conditions would weaken the crown's position. It could create expectations of renewed access, official appearances, or a gradual royal return that the palace had no intention of guaranteeing. Meghan was less shocked. To her, the invitation had never been a true welcome. It had been an examination. The palace wanted to discover whether Harry would submit to its boundaries before offering him even the smallest sign of acceptance. When he asked questions instead of agreeing, the door closed. The symbolism was brutal. Harry had hoped to enter as the king's son. Instead, he had been treated as an institutional risk whose presence required rules, safeguards, and emergency planning. He now faced another impossible choice. He could respond publicly and risk confirming the palace's fears. He could remain silent and allow royal officials to control the story. Or he could let allies reveal his disappointment indirectly, knowing even that might be blamed on him. Inside the palace, preparations were already underway. Statements were refined. Timelines were checked. Staff were warned not to discuss the abandoned meeting. The monarchy was protecting itself before Harry had even decided how to react. For him, the deepest pain was familiar. Duty had once again defeated emotion. Protocol had replaced reassurance. And the meeting that supported every hope of family access, security progress, ceremonial invitations, and a limited royal role was gone. Harry had not merely lost a conversation. He may have lost his final realistic route back. The cancellation wounded Harry as a son, but what happened next destroyed his hopes as a prince, because the palace had already begun dismantling every part of the return he believed was within reach. Harry's plan had depended on one private audience with the king. Once that meeting vanished, so did the promises, possibilities, and carefully imagined compromises surrounding it. Within days, what looked like the beginning of a royal return became a humiliating reminder that the monarchy had learned to continue without him. The collapse began quietly. Informal conversations about Harry appearing at future royal occasions were suspended. No official announcement was required. Without Charles's personal approval, advisors simply stopped moving the discussions forward. Invitations that had once seemed possible became uncertain, and carefully raised hopes disappeared into palace silence. The idea of a limited royal role also died almost immediately. Harry may have imagined supporting selected causes, attending important ceremonies, or representing the crown on rare occasions while keeping his independent life in California. But the palace had already rejected that model. There could be no royal authority without royal discipline, and no official crown position existing beside commercial freedom. Security remained another locked door. Harry wanted stronger guarantees before bringing Meghan and their children to Britain more frequently, but the cancelled meeting changed nothing. The issue remained trapped in legal and governmental processes that Charles could not simply erase. Without protection Harry considered adequate, even private family visits carried uncertainty. Then came the most painful consequence: access. Without restored trust, Harry could not assume invitations into the monarchy's inner world. Palace accommodation, private gatherings, ceremonial involvement, and direct contact with senior royals would remain privileges granted carefully, not rights automatically restored by birth. His thoughts reportedly turned to his children. They carried royal titles, yet risked growing up far from the institution those titles represented. Harry had once imagined them knowing royal traditions without being trapped by them. Now he faced the possibility that they would inherit the names but experience almost none of the world behind them. Meanwhile, the monarchy had changed. Duties once linked to Harry had been redistributed. Other royals had filled the gaps. Public attention had moved through scandal, sympathy, anger, and exhaustion. The institution had not remained frozen, waiting for him to return. That reality strengthened William's position. He no longer needed to argue that the crown could function without his brother. Time had already proved it. Meghan confronted Harry with the truth he had avoided. Any return would place him lower than before, with fewer privileges, tighter restrictions, and no promise that emotional wounds would heal. He would be expected to prove loyalty while receiving little control in return. Harry could not even shape the public story safely. Admitting he wanted back risked accusations of hypocrisy. Denying it allowed the palace to close the door without challenge. Charles might still meet him one day as a father. But being loved as a son was not the same as being trusted as a representative of the crown. The return had not collapsed merely because one meeting was cancelled. It had collapsed because the monarchy no longer believed it needed Harry back. But as Harry struggled with the collapse of his royal hopes, another question began haunting him. Had Meghan protected him from the palace, or had their shared war with the monarchy made reconciliation impossible? Whenever Harry's relationship with the royals collapses, attention inevitably turns toward Meghan. Palace loyalists see her as the force that pulled him away, while Harry sees the woman who understood his pain. Yet after the cancelled meeting, even their united front begins facing an uncomfortable question neither can easily answer. Almost immediately, quiet voices around the monarchy began shifting responsibility toward Meghan. The argument was familiar. Harry might have accepted the palace's conditions if his wife had not encouraged him to question them. To royal supporters, her influence had hardened his position and turned a possible reconciliation into another confrontation. Harry's response was instinctive. He defended her. The suggestion that he would simply return to royal life without Meghan reduced years of anger, grief, and family damage to one convenient explanation. In Harry's mind, she had not dragged him away. She had recognized wounds the palace had expected him to hide. Meghan saw the situation differently from Charles and his advisors. The monarchy, she believed, continued demanding loyalty without accepting responsibility. Harry was expected to remain silent, rebuild trust, and approach William without first receiving any meaningful acknowledgement of what he believed had happened to them. But behind their shared frustration, tension grew over what to do next. Harry favored patience. He believed a quiet period might prove he could handle disappointment without another public explosion. Meghan feared silence would allow the palace to define the entire episode, presenting Harry as difficult, unstable, or unwilling to compromise. There was another complication. Harry may not have told her exactly how close he believed the return had become. He had allowed himself to imagine success before the terms were settled, perhaps hoping to bring Meghan certainty instead of another fragile possibility. When the meeting disappeared, so did the future he had already begun describing to himself. The cancellation reopened old wounds, unanswered messages, missed opportunities. Private conversations followed by public contradictions, carefully written palace statements that made raw family pain sound like nothing more than a scheduling issue. Meghan's deepest concern was Harry's emotional vulnerability to Charles. One message from his father could restore years of buried hope. One cancellation could send him back into the same feeling of abandonment. Harry, meanwhile, resented that every dispute eventually became a judgment of his wife. Blaming Meghan allowed the monarchy to avoid the harder questions between Charles and his son, or between two brothers whose trust had collapsed long before this latest meeting. Then came the argument over a statement. Meghan understood that controlling the narrative could prevent another palace version from becoming accepted truth. Harry knew that speaking out might permanently end the private contact he still wanted. And the palace was watching. His reaction had become another test. Caught between two families, Harry remained silent, even as each side believed the other had already taken too much from him. Harry chose not to strike back immediately, hoping restraint would reopen the door, but the palace answered his silence with a colder strategy. It began erasing the need to respond to him at all. The monarchy did not need to condemn Harry publicly. It did not need another statement, rebuttal, or dramatic confrontation. Its most powerful response was silence. By refusing to explain the cancelled meeting or discuss a future role, the palace left Harry fighting an enemy that would not even acknowledge the battle. That silence created exactly what the institution needed: uncertainty without responsibility. Officials refused to confirm why the meeting had truly been cancelled, or what Charles had intended to discuss. Scheduling, health, duty, trust, and family tension all remained possible explanations. But none became official enough for Harry to challenge. This was the palace's oldest defense. Distance could weaken outrage. Delay could drain urgency. Protocol could turn emotional pain into an administrative matter. Rather than confront accusations directly, the monarchy could simply wait until the storm moved on. For Harry, that restraint felt merciless. He could not force a private answer through public pressure without proving the palace's argument against him. Another interview, statement, or carefully placed message might bring attention, but it could also appear to confirm that confidential disputes would never remain confidential. While Harry waited, royal life continued. Ceremonies were planned. Responsibilities were assigned. Public appearances went ahead. No empty space was left beside the king, and no official schedule suggested that Harry's possible return had ever been seriously considered. The machine moved forward because movement itself was the message. William's position grew stronger with every passing week. He represented continuity, discipline, and the future. Harry, by contrast, became tied to a chapter the institution appeared determined to close without publicly declaring it over. Charles's silence was harder to interpret. Perhaps it was strategic. Perhaps it was painful. Perhaps he feared another conflict, or simply lacked the courage to choose between his sons. But to Harry, the motive mattered less than the result. His father was still absent when he needed clarity most. Time now favored the palace. The longer Harry remained outside, the more natural his absence became. Each event conducted without him weakened the argument that he still belonged at the center. Public speculation filled the vacuum. Had he misunderstood the invitation? Had he demanded too much? Had he wanted royal status without royal limits? Every theory damaged him because the palace offered nothing firm enough to disprove. Meghan urged him to stop seeking validation from an institution that benefited from keeping him uncertain. Yet Harry could not surrender completely. Beneath the anger remained a son who believed something personal might still survive. Then came one final private message. It was brief, cautious, and painfully unclear. Family contact might be possible in time. No official role was promised. Harry finally faced the distinction the palace had been drawing all along. He might be invited back as Charles's son, but not welcomed back as a working royal. The palace had separated family from duty with ruthless precision, leaving Harry with one final decision: accept a smaller place in his father's life, or risk losing even that by fighting for the position he once abandoned. Harry's royal story may not be completely over, but the future waiting for him looks nothing like the return he imagined. The palace door may one day open for a private son, a grieving brother, or a visiting relative, but perhaps never again for a prince expecting his old power. That was the painful truth left behind by Charles's cancellation. Harry's connection to the monarchy could never be erased completely. He remained the king's son, William's brother, and part of a family history far larger than any personal dispute. But belonging to that history was no longer the same as holding a position within its power. The compromise available to him was deeply personal and brutally limited. Charles might one day agree to private meetings without announcements, ceremonial appearances, official duties, or promises about what would follow. There could be contact, perhaps even affection, but no guarantee that the institution would restore what Harry had lost. Accepting that arrangement would require him to separate two needs he had carried together for years. He would have to seek his father's love without treating it as a path back to royal authority. He would have to accept family without public recognition and reconciliation without victory. The alternative was continued conflict. Speaking out might protect his pride and preserve his version of events, but every new accusation could make future contact more difficult. It could also weaken the chance of Charles building a meaningful bond with Harry's children before time made that distance permanent. Meghan's position remained crucial. She could support private healing, but she was unlikely to accept an arrangement that placed their family once again beneath palace control. She understood that royal access often came with silence, obedience, and limits disguised as tradition. William's boundary appeared even harder. Civility might return one day, but trust could not be rebuilt through a single emotional meeting. It would require years of restraint, consistency, and proof that private pain would remain private. That was where the monarchy held its greatest advantage. It could wait. It could absorb departures, redistribute duties, and allow urgency to fade until yesterday's crisis became another chapter in royal history. Charles's cancellation had exposed the collision inside Harry. One part of him was a wounded son searching for his father. The other was a former working royal hoping the same conversation might reopen a place near the crown. Now he understood that birth had guaranteed him a place in the family's story, but trust determined whether he could share its authority. Charles may still meet him privately. Age, illness, regret, and legacy could soften the distance. Yet even a reunion would not restore the return Harry once imagined. The final question was no longer whether the palace would take him back. It was whether Harry could accept love without authority, family without status, and reconciliation without victory. The palace had never formally exiled him. It had simply kept moving until the role he wanted disappeared. And so Harry remains caught outside the institution that made him still a prince by blood, still a son in search of his father, but closer than ever to discovering that some royal doors do not slam shut. They close silently, one unanswered promise at a time.